Hey there folks, so welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we are finally going to be talking about the newest album from All Time Low called Last Young Renegade. So maybe I'm just not seeing the arguments anymore, but I remember distinctly back to the early mid-2000s, hell, probably even earlier than that, I just don't remember, the whole debate surrounding pop punk and to a lesser extent pop rock. And make no mistake, as the genres have ebbed and flowed in popularity, the split has become more pronounced. The old guard who preferred the rougher, more aggressive punk side, and the more mainstream accessible crowd who didn't really care as long as it was catchy. If it was pop, they didn't mind. And while I don't really see this debate going on much anymore in the rise of the internet, from what I can tell, look, on average, I'm gonna gravitate personally where the rougher, the better. When there's more texture, I like that. But I'm also the first to admit it's not the best fit for all bands. There is a spectrum when it comes to pop punk, and for every pop punk or pop rock band that sold out when they went more in that pop direction, there are a fair few more pop-friendly acts who courted some rougher audiences and didn't always stick the landing. I remember Fall Out Boy's hardcore album in 2013. So take a band like All Time Low, and right from the very beginning, I knew these guys would likely wind up a lot closer to radio-friendly pop rock than anything super aggressive or hardcore or political. And you know what? That's fine. They wrote fun, catchy hooks and fun, catchy songs, and when they got signed with Interscope, it seemed like the logical step. I mean, it was just bad timing. Dirty Work came out in the middle of the club boom of 2011, where if you weren't in Canada, pop rock wasn't getting airplay. Kind of a shame. Dirty Work's not a bad album, but it wasn't long before All Time Low was back on their indie label Hopeless and churning out more reasonably well-received pop punk albums. And to be completely honest, more often than not, there wasn't that much of a difference in their production or writing. I've listened to every single All Time Low album, and I found a lot of their material kind of runs together for me, not all that distinct, but I knew it wasn't going to be long before they would be back on a major label, so I wasn't surprised at all when they signed with Fuel by Ramen. And this is almost an unspoken law that Fuel by Ramen albums and bands tend to share some musical tropes year after year. When the buzz was suggesting that All Time Low was featuring more 80s inspired synth pop and new wave elements, hell, they even brought in Tegan and Sara for that cred, I felt like I knew exactly what I was going to get on Last Young Renegade. So did I get it? Well, yes and no. Here's the thing, I completely understand why the critical reception to Last Young Renegade, especially from hardcore All Time Low fans, has been mixed to disappointed at best. I'm covering this album fairly late after it's been released. I've seen the critical backlash. I mean, they were promised a slick, slightly more conceptual album that maybe got a little bit darker, and instead they got a very middle-of-the-road slice of underwhelming modern pop rock, with whatever punk edge nearly gone completely in favor of slicker polish the band has never really quite escaped. I think the difference for me personally is that while all of that is very true, I've never really been all that impressed or engaged by All Time Low anyway. And thus, while I can consider this a lesser entry in their discography, and it is, I'm not really all that annoyed or exasperated about it. I was never really a big All Time Low fan. This doesn't shock me all that much. Hell, considering how nondescript so much of the album sounds, I don't think it could shock me. I think the larger challenge with this review will be remembering enough in order to describe it. The most immediate comparison that actually leapt to my mind listening to this album, at least conceptually, was Linkin Park's Living Things, which actually had some prominent melodies, but the production did absolutely nothing in order to flatter or intensify them, which has left to a kind of a mediocre album. And that description, it fits Last Young Renegade to a T. There's no real bass intensity or rollick to the groove. The main liquid guitar line is nearly always placed to compete with the muddy cymbals or obvious drum machines, and more often than not, the melody loses out. And the entire mix is dampened by these synths that don't pick up a lot of tune themselves, and a very thick cushion of reverb and synthetic vocal samples, as if we needed that instead of a guitar line. In other words, if you've heard a modern pop song's tone or texture in the past 3 or so years, you would know exactly how this album would sound. But what gets kind of exasperating is that it feels precisely the wrong approach for a band like All Time Low, who want to go for big, anthemic bombast, but never really get the necessary support in the production. You would expect the guitars to roar and explode, pick up some bite or texture or rollick to say the obvious punk callback of Nice to Know You. But despite the tempo to that song, there's no real edge or distinctive tune to it, just an indistinct blur of strumming that can't pick up the significant feedback or swell. Typically, a good way to utilize reverb in these cases is to emphasize specific elements, like a powerhouse guitar solo or a massive main riff or a percussion accent. But the blanket approach places everything on the same level, and any distinctive tune or element just loses all of its character, falls back into the blob of sound. And that's not saying that there aren't elements that have potential. I like the darker rattle of the guitar that opened up Nightmares, or the darker echo playing off the bass in Dark Side of Your Room. It's got a little bit of grit to that, but without properly centering or accentuating those elements, or hooks that they can play off of those distinct anchor points, the songs just become kind of indistinct. They run together, there's not a lot to them. Now again, that's not saying that there aren't moments or instrumental elements that had promise for me. Ironically, when this record tilts even further into the synthesizers for a mostly workable atmosphere. I'll be the first to say that I wish that Dirty Laundry actually exploded a little bit more beyond the final hook, but that restrained, chugging groove actually kind of worked for me. And even if Afterglow feels kind of overmixed, it's got some shimmering gloss to the effects I actually kind of like. There's more of a melody there, and it's a good hook. And unsurprising to pretty much nobody, Tegan and Sara are very welcome on ground control, offering a solid emotive counterpoint to the spacey blur of the synths and the tighter groove. It's not as relentless or sharp as your average Tegan and Sara synth pop song, but hey, it'll do in a pinch. But one thing they also do add is some welcome support for Alex Gaskarth, the frontman. And honestly, while I think he doesn't deliver as raw or potent of a performance as he could beyond songs like Drugs and Candy, it's not all of his fault. Again, this is where the production really hurts All Time Low on this album, because the vocal placement within the mix can be kind of haphazard, and while they will pile on the effects and sounds, you'll often get the impression that stronger multi-tracking behind him might help a lot more of that anthemic vibe than all the tacked on millennial whoops would, which just becomes a cliche at this point. It doesn't really help the songs feel anthemic. I mean, here's the thing. If the writing was there, I could be a little bit more forgiving of underwhelming production or delivery. I wouldn't say anything on that recent Def Havana album was revolutionary from a production standpoint, but the really strong vocals and the solid songwriting greatly elevated that album. It's one of my favorites this year. Unfortunately, All Time Low have never really struck me as distinct songwriters, and in going even broader on Last Young Renegade, they only serve to make these songs seem less distinct, have less personality. The metaphors of troubled relationships, small town departures, burned out flickers of love, they feel increasingly pedestrian. Not really bad, but nothing all that new or distinctive either. Rarely helped by delivery to add subtext or nuance. Nice to Know You is perhaps the most bizarre example of this. For a song supposedly celebrating the small town come up and those dive bars, it seems in an awful hurry to move on to the next town, or take Dark Side of Your Bedroom, which is playing for taking advantage of in a bad relationship and learn just to brush it off. But the emotional dynamic here feels so muddled that I can't really tell if it's gunning for sympathy, exasperation, or anger. It's a weird sort of song. Similar case for Life at the Party, which focuses on a wild debauched night and Gaskarth losing his connection with himself, but it seems to be missing that added bit of complexity to actually step away from that life and what consequence that could bring for him, or whether or not he's got mixed feelings about that. And I'm not saying that they can't get some of that nuance. I liked how Dirty Laundry acknowledges that history in relationships can be hard to overlook, but since it makes up who they both are as people, they should embrace as much as they can. Or the foundation of trust and love beyond distance on Ground Control. I like that song. But again, on a 10-song album that's gunning to be all anthems, there is just way too many songs where the writing just felt interchangeable or lacking distinctive detail or character or subtext to really elevate these pieces. Not egregiously bad, sure, but not remotely memorable either. And you know what? That's probably the way I would sum up Last Young Renegade by All Time Low as a whole. Look, I'm not against this sort of new wave shift in principle, but for All Time Low, it put a damper on their greatest strengths and didn't do much in order to compensate, leading to a muddy, mostly forgettable project that I understand why the hardcore fans have turned on this in droves, and it didn't really sell all that well. Really, I'm surprised that it had so much to say about it as I did, because I'm still giving it only a 5 out of 10 and only really recommend it if you're curious. It's been out for nearly 2 months now, so I guess you want to check it out if you want. Hell, Fueled by Ramen have put out better material in the new wave vein with Paramore's last album this year. All Time Low didn't need to go in that direction. But hey, when you stick with the house label sound, you're gonna reap both dividends and losses, especially if a band is gonna change their sound to get there. So if All Time Low, if they stick with this, well, I guess we'll see what happens, but I don't have high hopes. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. Yes, I know this review has been very long in coming, but hey, finally got to the top of the Patreon schedule. I'm happy I covered it. Link to buy it, description below if you're absolutely curious. Don't really recommend it if I'm being honest. But hey, the poll's up there. I'm curious where the more All Time Low fans will fall on this. I can imagine they kind of agree with me. I saw that critical backlash. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get more involved in my scheduling process, so I could have covered this back in June, Link to my Patreon right there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week you guys get to add records or even movies to said schedule for the higher tier contributors. More details right there, but till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.